Right. Kia ora koutou katoa. So my name is Mark Sluchak-Resch, and this is the first session in our Veracity Lab webinar series on the digital strategy for Aotearoa. Very exciting to be here. And in welcoming you to this webinar, we would like to first and foremost acknowledge the mana whenua of this region. I'm actually based close to Te Whanganui-a-Tara. So specifically, I'm in Waiwhitu, just a walk away from Te Whiti Park and Te Aotearoa Marae down the road. And all the other places you are joining us from, we would like to acknowledge the different skills and expertise that you each bring to this conversation. So Norera tēnā koutou katoa. Veracity Lab is a new initiative that comes out of the Veracity Technology Spearhead research project funded under the CIFTI National Science Challenge. We started in July. And in that project, we are addressing the profound scientific questions around how we build digital systems that ensure trust, truthfulness, and authenticity in any kind of interaction and transaction we encounter, whether it's the real or the virtual world. So back to the purpose of these webinars, we're holding these webinars to create awareness of the fundamental issues that technologies that erode trust, and that's and to stimulate a broad conversation on how we can get out of this to move into a positive, optimistic digital future, as just represented in that video. Now, moving on to our speaker today. So because the way we want to run those webinars is we have a short impulse speech by someone, but then it should be an open conversation. Our speaker today is Professor Steve Reeves, who's a professor for computer science from the University of Waikato. And he will briefly elaborate on blockchain as an example of a technology that is often brought up when it comes to trust, the focus of our today's webinar. And it's a great privilege that Steve can give this opening presentation. Thanks, Steve. And after that, I will open the floor for a conversation that should be inclusive, fair, and just. We want all people to feel safe, that they can bring in their personal perspective to this conversation. Now, a final disclaimer: as you realized, we're recording this webinar, and we consider to make the recording available on our website. So if you're speaking or switching your video on at some stage, you have to be aware that you will be appearing in this recording of the webinar. And with having that said, over to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks very much, Marcus. Yeah, I just want to try and be brief in sort of covering, as Marcus has said, a technology which has had a lot of attention over the last decade or so since it was invented, but it's often coupled with what you might call outrageous claims around it, and particularly in the area of sort of trustability and things like that. So I'm just assuming that people know almost nothing about this so-called blockchain technology, and I'll keep this at a very high level as well, certainly as far as the technology is concerned. So I've got a few slides to show. Let me, hopefully you can see that now. It's just a couple of slides with some headings in, really. And this first sort of point is that as I said, I'm really going to work at a very abstract level, because it's not the technology itself I'm interested in here. It's the effects of that technology, particularly when it impinges on things that in the Veracity project we're interested in. So I'm just saying, think of whatever these things are, blockchains is a very large database. It's distributed as many times as people who want to use it want to copy it. And also anyone can read and write to this database, and anyone can help maintain the database. So that's basically what it is. Think of it as a large collection of data. Anyone can copy it, anyone can look at it, anyone can read it, anyone can write to it, and anyone can help maintain this thing. The remarkable thing is that even with those properties, a blockchain, a database of this sort, once information is in there, it's, as we say, immutable. In other words, nobody within known sort of parameters can change that. So essentially, nobody can change it. So as I've said, the central point is once written to the database, a record can't be changed. And in particular, it can't be changed maliciously. So that's a good thing. Or by the writer of it originally. So once you put something into one of these blockchains, it's there essentially forever. And that obviously is going to have repercussions for us. So just to make the point again, even though these large databases are thousands of times copied, loads of people have them, anyone can have one, the consensus mechanism, as it's called, which was introduced in 2009 by Satoshi Nakamoto, who is either a him or a her or a there, we don't know, allowed such a distributed database with free access, but allowed us to keep the information completely secure once it's in there. So that all sounds wonderful, right? And yeah, I thought I'd just finish off by saying one thing about this immutability, the Nakamoto consensus protocol, is that, of course, distributed databases weren't invented in 2009. They've been around for decades. But it's been a sort of a holy grail to have a distributed database with this complete security and immutability. So 2009 and the work of Nakamoto was an incredible moment, really, because this holy grail had been attained for the very first time. So all you need to take from this is this idea of a completely open, distributed, enormous database. That's essentially a blockchain. I mean, I'm skating over a huge amount of detail here, but that's the sort of thing to keep in mind. And this immutability is at the core of it. One other thing about, one other sort of thing you can say or categorize the taxonomy of these sort of blockchains is that they can either be public or private, or permissioned or permissionless. And briefly, I'm going to talk about public permissionless blockchains. That is the ones I've just described. Anyone can read, anyone can write, anyone can maintain. There are things which perhaps call themselves blockchain because it's such a hype term, but because, for example, they're private, they're perhaps no more than distributed databases, in fact. So there are lots of sort of subtle differences here, but I'm just going to talk about the private permissionless ones because they have all those properties that I mentioned on that last slide. And of course, the two most famous, I guess, blockchain systems are Bitcoin, because it was the first. This is one that Nakamoto invented. And of course, it's notorious for all sorts of reasons. But it has a distinction of being the first. And basically, the things that you can put on the Bitcoin blockchain are just transactions. And just think of those as like transactions that you see written in a, an accounting ledger. It says this money comes in from these people and this money goes out to these people. And that's all that you see on the Bitcoin blockchain. Those are the only records. The other important landmark was this blockchain called Ethereum. And what that did was keeping the underlying technology that's behind Bitcoin, in other words, the public permissionless system, distributed to whoever wants to use it, and so on and so on. But the transactions were hugely generalized to be any program, any computer program. So whereas the Bitcoin records were just these values move from here to here, an Ethereum record is essentially just a computer program. And it's a program that someone writes in the programming language of Ethereum, which is called Solidity. And instead of just a transaction going on to the blockchain like with Bitcoin, these completely general programs, which can do anything any program can do, that someone's written to do whatever they want, is the thing that gets recorded on the blockchain, basically. So that was a big change. We generalized from very simple programs, which are just the transactions, to any program that anyone can write in any programming language, essentially. And again, historically, this is an important thing because it was the first example of a blockchain that had completely general programs as the things that were recorded on it. One thing I should say, and this is sort of all around the hype thing, is that Vitalik Buterin, who invented the Ethereum blockchain, a few years ago now, tweeted this thing that I've quoted here, because what you might have heard about Ethereum and blockchains like it are these things called smart contracts. As you can see, he regrets that name now, because of course it's been completely hyped, because smart contract sounds a fantastic thing. Smart contracts are just the programs that I was talking about earlier. So you can see, rather than even calling them programs, Buterin said he'd like to have called them something like persistent scripts. So scripts are just programs. Persistent is this thing of, once it's written to the blockchain, then it's there forever. And it's public and everyone can see your programming, basically. And that's a point that actually has caused lots of other problems, which I'll touch on right at the end in a moment. So, as I said, the things that you write to the blockchain are immutable. Everyone can see them. No one can change them, even the person that wrote them. So a big question, as I've got here, is when you make a mistake, and of course we all make mistakes when we program, what happens? Well, it's there forever and everyone can see it. So clearly what you can do is, you haven't got much room for maneuver there, and what's more, the whole world can see the mistakes you've made. So, you know, that's something to think about. One answer to what happens, actually, I'll just take that away again. One answer to what happens is that is an example of the first big problem with Ethereum, which was that people sort of took seriously the idea of having the rules of an organization actually encoded in the program that they put onto the blockchain. So the good things about that is that the rules of the organization are completely public. No one can tamper with them. Everyone has to follow them if they're using the program that sort of embodies this organization. So those are all, on the surface, good things. The big problem was that in the underlying programming language of Ethereum, there was an error. There were probably others, but there was an error here, which meant that people could use the program that implemented this company to steal money, basically. And because the program that implemented this company was on the blockchain and therefore immutable, a big problem had arisen, because now there's this thing there that people are using to steal money with, but you can't do anything about it because it's on this, you know, thousands and thousands of times copied, completely public thing, which has got immutable programs on it. So what happened was that, sort of the obvious thing, but the thing that goes completely against the whole philosophy behind a lot of this blockchain work, is that a small group of people who were basically a sort of a kernel, a small group of the maintainers, had to step in and change the actual Ethereum system in order to fix this thing that was allowing all this stealing to go on. And the problem with that, of course, is that they stepped outside the rules of the system that they built. So the system is built, and you're told the rules are completely immutable and they're public, so everyone knows exactly what's going on. Something terrible happened, and a small group came in and changed the rules. And that, of course, caused huge controversy because, as I say, it's completely outside the philosophy of these things. What has happened is that one group has gone off with so-called Ethereum Classic, which is Ethereum with the flaws in it, because they've said we've got to stick to our philosophy that we started with. And another group has gone with the mended Ethereum, because they said it's more important to step away from our philosophy and repair the mistake so that people can use the thing more safely in the future. But what this brings out is that against all of the somewhat hyped benefits of these very public but immutable databases, the big question is, as I've said there, what happens when mistakes are made? And inevitably, because there are people involved, they will be made. Another thing to mention here, before I finish, which I will do quite soon, is that the immutability of data or programs or whatever on the blockchain, of course, confers absolutely no element of truthfulness of that data. So there's a sort of an updated version of the old data processing adage of garbage in, garbage out going on here. Because just because the data you put on the blockchain is immutable and therefore you know it's not going to change, so it could be a source of truth for you, if the data that's put on there in the first place is itself not true, then all sorts of problems flow from that as well. So, and this is something that Marcus sort of alluded to, that the fact that something is a blockchain or is data that's on a blockchain confers absolutely no quality of truthfulness or something you can depend on. Certainly once it's there, you can depend on the fact it's not going to change. But if it's there unchanging and it's actually false, then of course you've got no guarantees. So this is one of the dangers, I think, with the enormous hype around blockchains, is that people either through ignorance or through deviousness can sort of use this to imply more properties, especially around truthfulness of these things, than really you should. So just to conclude, what I want to do is think about what I've just said about the garbage in, garbage out sort of thing, and the fact that if there are errors in the programs on your blockchain, you can't fix them. The questions around immutability, the public nature, and this sort of resolving conflict come up over and over again, and there's certainly veracity concerns. The immutability is this thing of, if you make mistakes, it's there and fixed. The public nature means those mistakes are very, very open to everyone because anyone can look at these things. And the whole resolving conflict thing comes up again and again, especially with veracity concerns, because the question is, if you find there are errors in something you've put on there, or even in the underlying system, what do you do? And I think just to finish, one emerging thing is what you should do is agree on your governance rules before you start using the blockchain, basically. Because otherwise you have to do what Ethereum did, which was you find there's an error and then you have to retrofit some governance, which inevitably some people are not going to be happy with, and you just get conflict and so on. Just one final thing is other work I've been doing, and it's nice to see Ben from Aho here because he knows this well. A while ago, I had a project which was sort of asking the question, can we use blockchain for example, storage of taonga, whakapapa, for example? And essentially the answer came back from the community, no, they're not suitable. And the problems are all, again, the ones that I've just mentioned. The immutability perhaps isn't such a problem, but the public nature can be a problem because, some of these things, tikanga might say are not for public consumption. And the resolving conflict thing comes up again as well. And this is work that Ben and Aho have been doing most recently around, if you've got several competing arguments about something going on, how do you eventually, you can certainly store all those arguments, all those conversations, all those corridors, but at some point somebody has to come in and say, okay, this is the decision we're going to make, which brings together perhaps, or at least resolves some conflict by saying, this is the way we're going to go. And it's not clear that a blockchain can help you there, even though on the face of it, it seems it might do. And again, various other avenues are being taken. So I think just to finish finally, on the face of it, something like a blockchain technology would seem to be ideal when you have concerns around veracity, truthfulness, that sort of thing. But actually, that's a rather naive or perhaps overhyped view. And the world is much more subtle, and we need to think much more deeply before we throw technical solutions, which on the surface seem to be ideal, but perhaps actually aren't. So I hope what I've said there sort of, hope everyone understands what I've been saying, and I'm sure some people are going to disagree with it, which is part of the point here. So it'd be good if we could have a good conversation around that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. And as you say, so this is we picked the topic of blockchain distributed ledger technology here as one that is in the public discourse when it comes to trust. You can buy solutions of that kind, but we use it as a stimulator of that actually unpacking the issue of trust. It becomes a little bit more complicated. So at this stage, we would like to open the floor for questions, either to the speaker or speaking in general, the relationship between the truth theme in the strategy document. It's and I see that Barbara Kuriger, National MP and Member of Parliament, just raised her hand. So Barbara, please, over to you.
Thank you. I was really just interested, Steve, in that whole issue of resolving conflict and trust. Because effectively, you know, what I took from that is if it's a bit like having a constitution of a company. If you actually have to try and change the rules partway through, and people are not sure, the minute you change the rules, you're almost the trust is out the window, and it could end up ultimately being the end of the game, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's another aspect of exactly the same problem. Yeah, I mean, for the Ethereum people, you know, the philosophy was basically an anarchist philosophy, and they wanted to say, we code up the rules and then we just let it go and no humans get involved anymore. But they hit the problem that there was a flaw in the technology and they had to step in and essentially change it. And you're right, you know, they had this split because one half said, well, that's against the philosophy. They, as you say, they lost trust in the system, and you know, it's had huge repercussions. So the whole sort of thing of encoding the rules on the one hand looks a really good idea, because once the rules are encoded, people can step back and it just sort of happens. But the problem is, if there's something wrong with the technology or there's something wrong with the rules, then you have to sort of retrofit some governance, and that's always a disaster. So yeah, as you say, you need to have the governance sorted out before you start using the technology, essentially. It doesn't solve any problems if you don't.
Barbara, do you have a straight response to that? Because you put the hand back up, or was it an accident?
Was an accident.
No problem at all. Because then Ben put his hand up. Ben from Aotearoa. Ben.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Hey, yeah, thanks, Steve. I always love like the you know, the simple breakdowns of it, because it is really good just to talk about it in a really kind of clear way. But I thought. You know, we're kind of talking about two things here, because you're talking about encoding the rules for the system within the blockchain, you know, through those persistent scripts. And that's different to encoding the data within the blockchain, right? And so you know, you can trust the data without necessarily having to, well, you can run a blockchain that manages your data without necessarily encoding the rules within the blockchain too. So we might have, you know, something that's, you know, run our scripts that aren't immutably, and so we can change them and we can correct flaws, but the data's always there. And so the fact that you might have made a mistake about data is fine, because then you just make another, you know, add another data point that says, oh, and this fixed it, so it was wrong here and now it's right. But I'm wondering, so my question then goes to around, around veracity, how important is it to have trust within the system, which would, and that's when you would go all the way through your persistent scripts or your smart contracts to just having trust within the data where, you're just using the blockchain for, persistent immutable data and records. So yeah, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts around that, and what approach might the Veracity Lab team be taking those two different aspects into it?
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're right. And as far as, I just to sort of answer that final question, I think my view, actually, even though I'm a skeptical enthusiast for this sort of technology, I would say that this isn't the way we want to go, actually, because it's there's so much of it which is, the persistent stuff, the immutability stuff, is probably not quite the right thing, and also the public nature of something like Ethereum is probably not the right thing. We want more subtle ways, more subtle technology, if you like, to underpin the sorts of things that the Veracity Lab is interested in. So on the surface, this looks like a good thing, but I think actually it's not the right technology usually. Having said that, of course, and this is sort of coming back to your point, I think, there's no reason why a group can't essentially use blockchain technology if it's private, perhaps, so that they have more control over who sees their data and so on. That sort of is stepping away from the sort of Bitcoin and Ethereum philosophy. So I would say that the common or the pure forms of blockchain are probably not suitable for the sorts of things we're interested in. But that's not to say that aspects of it might not be. And, the work that you're doing, for example, I think it isn't blockchain, but it clearly has some of the same philosophy in some ways. So, I think it's early days, but I don't think blockchain in the pure form is the way that we want to go for lots of reasons.
Just picking that up, Steve, can you unpack that a little bit when you make the reference to the system that Ben is building and explain how that diverts and is and there was also the question in the chat whether could you describe this sort of more gentle technology that is more appropriate and suitable for this situation?
Well, to be honest, since Ben's here, he can describe it better than I can, certainly. I don't know if he wants to.
Ben, would you do that?
I mean, sure. I mean, we have an append-only log database, so we don't process transactions in blocks, so it's not a blockchain. We don't have a consensus network, a consensus algorithm. We don't need 100% consensus across the network because it's completely distributed and it's completely private as well. So it's not public. Blockchains are more a decentralized thing where everybody can kind of participate. A distributed network is, there are some similarities towards it, but definitely not everyone is involved in the participation of it and aren't required to be. So yeah, I mean, there are some similarities in there, and that affords us the ability to be able to track conversations or different claims and different statements from a bunch of different people and have that persist across. Imagine, everybody became really brilliant knowledge holders and everybody just could remember everything that they were told. You don't necessarily need to know everything, but you just know everything that you've been told. And you're also really good at passing that information on to other people. And that's similar to what we're trying to kind of replicate, I guess, within the technology and making our way through that. But we don't have smart contracts. None of our programming is written to the blockchain at all. It's just, it's yeah. So we can, if we make any programming errors, which every programmer does, we can correct our program. We don't need to, we don't need to get consensus from everybody across the network to do that either. So yeah.
And
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different options here, and it is really interesting for them to be explored, I think, especially from this angle. Yeah.
and just to add to that, one point that certainly Aho and we have reached, in our work with them, which is fairly young work, is the really interesting thing of when you do have several incompatible descriptions of some story or something like that, or the history of something. How do you handle resolving that incompatibility? Again, underpinned by the technology. So from my point of view, that's an interesting point we've reached in the work with Aho, is this sort of conflict resolution thing. And well, we haven't done anything on that yet, but that's certainly a point we've reached that we realize we need to do work on.
Thank you. We have a sign of hand by Guy.
I come from a scientific background. It's very interesting where you just landed up, Steve. I was sort of contrasting different fields and the way one approaches truth. In science, you tend to have competing paradigms, and it's a moving target. But one important aspect of it is that statements have to be testable. So human networks are quite different. They involve a lot of belief, and people commit themselves to various kinds of human networks, not necessarily rationally or testably. And they sort of almost give up a part of themselves, really. I belong to this group or that group or so on. What you're trying to do, and I'm not a programmer, it seems to me, is to have data continuously connected to truth. And the kind of models that you're going to find that are going to that achieve that are, you're going to find, my background is in theoretical physics, you're going to find, particle field dualities, for example. Particles are units of data, and they're continuously connected to fields at smaller time and distance scales. And that makes reality real, and that's what you're really trying to achieve in the field of data. And if you come back to a sort of a human way of looking at it, that we are always connected to our notion of self. So we're always checking experience against our notion of who we are. And that's what you're trying to achieve in the data field. That's, that's going to be quite hard, but I think from my point of view as a scientist who's engaged rather in long format rather than short format stuff, then I think this question, is it testable, is a very, very important aspect of data, because otherwise, as you've just said, Steve, you're going to end up with a plethora of different points of view. And you're also going to end up with the difficulty that you've identified something as truth when, it's a kind of a theory. It's not highly enough verified, and that's how are you going to interface with science as as a fully provable proposition. Anyway, those are the comments I had. Fascinating discussion. I've never even heard of blockchains, so very interesting for me. Thank you.
Yeah, no, those are really good points, I think. And I don't have any answers to those questions, not surprisingly, but I think, again, what it comes down to is all we have here is, in some sense, the recording of data. And the thing I was sort of, I guess, advising against is taking on board or even believing a lot of the hype that surrounds this technology. It's almost as though I mean, it sounds silly when you say it this broadly. It's almost as though because it's on the blockchain, it must be true. I mean, that's clearly silly, but that's only a simplified form of some of the hype around this. So I think, you know, that's one thing that I'm sort of, you know, trying to guard against, is falling for that sort of thing, let alone the sort of much more complicated, deep and subtle things that Guy, you were mentioning. So
well, I used to work for Genetic ID, and our business was connecting organic produce or bulk international deals to tests. And you know, that's when you're basically trying to give certainty to data. You know, I'm selling organic potatoes. How do I know that they're organic potatoes? So once you've got a test there and you've got a sampling methodology and so on and so forth, getting into that with, you know, much more generalized human data, I mean, that's really, and how do you guard against it being misused, basically? I mean,
yeah.
that is the serious question of the moment, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, for example, Brendan here can attest to that with the work that he's been doing as well. So, and many others here as well, I think. Yeah, so it is at least a big, interesting question, you know, that we're trying to tackle here, which I think is a good thing.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Guy. Allow me one remark from the perspective of the Veracity project as a whole, but also from the perspective of the digital strategy draft document that we're seeing, right? So we're looking at the theme of trust overall as it's described and framed in the strategy. Then there is a lot in there about not the expectation, but the goal to have people trust in technology, right? So and I think we see that under the hood of the technological questions about trust and truth, things get very complicated very quickly, as we see from the conversation we just had. So that's a tricky one. But actually, taking also into account, for example, Ben's experience with Aotearoa and Steve involvement in that research project, trust is also about an ability to choose a paradigm that works for a community, right? So we're not advocating or creating a case or saying that there should be the one system of truth and trust within a country, but there should be an interface between what communities run, for example, right? And that becomes an interesting conversation from the perspective of the strategy, right? We can create trust in technology if there is deep insight and possibly also control or oversight or governance within the communities who deal with the actual artifact, the data, and the concern, right? So, and one big question that we want to highlight from the perspective of the Veracity project is that to achieve that, actually, as a nation, one has to step up a level and say connectivity was a very good step and very required for all of this. But now we're at a level where we need to interface different systems so that it doesn't become something that is done to some communities, for example, because that, of course, will immediately erode trust, right? Because it's a system that is imposed, that says the only inferred truth is the thing that comes out of this. So, and that is what in the scientific world we would call data infrastructure. So it's a higher order infrastructure that says it's not just a cable for connectivity, but it's actually services that allow communities, and that could be industry consortia, for example, that have a very, very perfect solution for a supply chain problem, or it could be iwi and hapu that solve a data problem within their community, where they can interface within that system that then solves the interoperability question. So, which itself has questions of trust, right? So, and I think that it's important to say it's about always about the existence and coexistence of those systems. Does anyone else has any concerns? I mean, there is the strategy throws up questions such as, for example, just to pick them up and throw them in the mix and blend them with what we just heard. Yeah, so it's about assurances that services and technologies consumers use are adequately protected, and that the information is used in ways they expect, right? So, so the question is if that applies, for example, to a system we use in our private lives. We just heard about Facebook converting to the metaverse, right? So how can a country actually ensure that whatever I do in that space happens on the terms of what we find appropriate? What is it that we find appropriate as people of New Zealand to happen, right? So underlying the question of the expectation that is formulated here, we want to assure something, is actually first the negotiation of what we think is acceptable, and secondly, the unpacking of the technical problem that is at work here, right? Because these are networked technologies, usually on the basis of internet protocols, and they work in a very specific way that actually doesn't support a lot of control to enforce and track and trace once you've given something away. So so it sinks down to further questions of that kind, and actually becomes, as we've seen with the blockchain example, a little bit more complicated in terms of the computational questions. But what we want to highlight still is that before you can start that journey, actually, to say we want you to trust things, is actually the question to what is it that we want to trust? How do we want to operate privately as a business? From and within New Zealand, and then connected to the world when we're dealing with something that is or becomes digital, right? So because some of our things are naturally digital, other things become digital, so that it's the digital twin of the apple, for example, that then allows us to trace where has it been, who has delivered it, maybe even the opinion of the person that ate it, right? So what part of that is actually a digital asset that we need to qualify and also protect within the shores, and when does it move offshore and is therefore then out of the hands, and where's that sort of, how do you draw those boundaries and lines? And that's just one of those examples. The same one is or a similar one applies when we're asking for responsible development of artificial intelligence. I mean, that becomes again a profound technical question very quickly, because we actually need to return to the drawing board to understand what's going on when we're dealing with AI, right? So very often data and energy hungry is probably a way how I would describe that, right? So these artificial agents don't exist because just from scratch and know things. They learn it from data patterns, right? That they pick up. Can we change it? Or will that ever be trustworthy? Because in some way I will have to give something to it. And so all of those questions, and that is, I think, what we wanted to highlight also with that conversation, become much more complex than we think at the sort of surface level when we engage with them and say like, oh, we could apply them. Because the answer is yes, you can apply things like a distributed ledger, a blockchain technology, and achieve something. But now unpacking it may actually show a bit more detailed issues that may in the end clash with what our expectation as a society is. And we really want to highlight that bit, that social contract, that social awareness of what's going on and what do we want to be transparent to us what's going on, right? So I think from a perspective of that project, fostering that conversation is quite crucial, which was also the sort of one of the points in our video.
We could break down the notion of trust into, is it real? Is it fair? And what will it do? You know, those are, you know, because trust is, yeah, sure, I trust, we've all had experiences of people we trust suddenly knifing us in the back. So those are, you know, I think you have to, fairness is something that really defines our you know, Kiwi mentality, and that's, you know, that's how I view it. You know, trust is, you know, in the movies you see this all the time. You know, the guy's a villain when he says trust me. You know, and so it's a misused concept. So anyway, that's might follow on.
Yep, excellent point. I think, yeah, it subscribe or underlines what I tried to say. Yes, it's fairness with each other. Yes. So Tim, you raised your hand. Tim Packer.
Oh, yeah, kia ora, Marcus and all. Tim Packer, community gardener here. Look, I suppose to me, I'm thinking glass half full here. The same technologies that we are concerned of around these trust issues could actually be used to build trust, right? So if you look at, say, an organic farmer that's going through regulators and certification paperwork that might have been only used to literally paperwork, and the feedback loops are not immediate or observable. Surely these technologies can be used to take them along on a journey that actually provides meaningful and swift feedback, and the same blockchain technologies can literally, if we trust the governance at the start and the finish, the immutable aspect allows us to actually I suppose reduce or eliminate intermediaries, so we can actually build a much more efficient trust chain, perhaps, right? So I appreciate that's a glass half full and there's a lot of issues around that, but I do see the potential anyway. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Steve, is that a thing that you would like to pick up again?
No, just briefly. I mean, yeah, Tim's right. I mean, we see that, great use of these public blockchains when it comes to supply chains, for example. In fact, supply chains can turn into supply stars, where everyone in what was a chain who only used to know about the people next to them can now actually see all the information about something as it moves both towards them and away from them, because of the public but immutable nature of these things. And yeah, as Tim has said, that sort of openness and extra information allows more trust in something like a supply chain than you would get in sort of conventional ways of organizing them. So certainly, yeah, to be more positive, there are gains in trust to be had from this technology. But I think it is the right thing. And as someone said in the chat, Peter said in the chat, the challenge really isn't the technology. It's prior to that, as I was talking about governance, but also actually knowing what the community you're working with counts as trust and fairness. I mean, that's a prior step. And just very briefly going back to something Marcus was saying about the digital strategy document, I think a lot of that aspect is missing. It's sort of written from the point of view of the technology is completely neutral. The technology has no bearing as technology on things like trust, for example. But of course, that isn't true, right? Directly you decide on a certain technology, you have perhaps subconsciously imposed certain properties, certain qualities. And I think we need to be aware of that. This technology is not neutral. And to assume it is to make a very first wrong step. And I think that's a big weakness currently in that document, perhaps.
We had a sign of hand from Barbara again. Sorry, Barbara.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to mention on the topic of trust. So just an example of that, and it's a slightly different issue, but we recently just did a bill in Parliament that was related to live streaming, and so we've got old legislation that fits quite nicely with printed material or other types of material, but because live streaming is quite new, we got to the point where we passed that legislation, but to do that, the minister and the committee had to remove the fact that we were going to put a filter in there because the public were very uncomfortable about what it was that was going to be filtered. So, you've kind of got to, as you're updating and using new technology, taking the public with you and the level of trust around what you're doing is really important, because that was just one of those things they didn't mind the chief censor being able to, put a 20-day ban on it, or take it out and having 20 days right of appeal for people. But they weren't comfortable with having the filter because they weren't quite sure about what might be seen as objectionable. And we had to go back to the original legislation to do the definition of that. But it's just, when people are dealing with new things, it's really important to be able to get that level of trust right there and then. So different issue, but on public trust, it's a good example.
I think it's an excellent example. Thank you, Barbara, for sharing that. And I think that also shows that sort of ambivalence that we're meeting as well. I think the one really positive point about the digital strategies draft is actually it has quite an optimistic stance, right? It says it explains the opportunity. We all know there's great opportunity in artificial intelligence for well-being, right? For example, to predict disease, accidents, and so on and so forth. But it always comes with a downside of possibly hyper-surveillance, right? Because it needs to collect those patterns first to be able to predict those things. It has to be very invasive, right? And as we move along, those opportunities will always be more and more invasive into what we do, which is why we think that this sort of conversation about the social contract, awareness, taking the people onto the journey of establishing what is expected, what people want is quite crucial. Yeah. Great example, Barbara. Thank you. Now, being mindful of time, it's 8:28. We planned for until 8:30. I would like to hand over for a wrap up to Brandon, the Associate Director for the Veracity Lab, who sort of listened into the conversation and is the person that wants to sort of wrap this session up. Thank you, Brandon.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marcus. So I've been taking notes. That was great. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Steve, for introducing us to the blockchain and giving us a brief on that. I'm just going to go through on some key themes that emerged that I've written down. And one of the key ones is trying to understand trust itself with new technology and how that mirrors with the new policy that has been created, and how we actually integrate with that. So I do actually think Guy's piece around the notions of truth we need to be explored. So when we talk about truth, there's more than one truth, and it has lots of stretch, and that it's culturally flexible in certain circumstances. And I think those three questions about, those big three of that, those three remind me again, Guy, is it real? And what will we do with it? And can it be trusted? So, and it's often a misused concept. Did I catch those three, Guy? Was there another one?
Yeah. Is it real?
Fairness, yeah. Yeah, so fairness is a really important concept, and it is actually, interestingly, as one of our use cases, fairness is a key principle of organic as well. So I think those are really helpful as we align and the Veracity Lab evolves for us to align our values, and we too have to be public. And so this sort of forum is very important for us to check our thinking and to get feedback and to help us engage with our submission. Because just to let everybody know, part of the purpose of this is that we are actually writing a submission and for the digital Aotearoa. So that's a very important part. And is there anything that anybody else wants to say before I just remind us what's happening tomorrow night? Is there any sort of key piece that we've missed or key insight someone else had? No? Okay, so having said that, what I just would like to do is just to thank you very much, everybody, for coming. So we're now in, we're bang on 8:31, and tomorrow night, same time, November the 3rd, 7:30 to 8:30, we're having Mahi, which is growth, and Enrico Tronchen, who's part of the Science Challenge, will be emceeing, and we'll be working with Professor Jans Derek out of Victoria, and Marcus, who's been talking tonight, also out of Wellington, will be working with us, talking about growth. So having said that, I wish everybody a good night and look forward to, and we've got some other messages in here for everybody joining us. So look, thank you very much, everybody. Have a safe, if you're traveling, have a safe journey home and enjoy the rest of the night.